All right, here we go. Welcome, folks. Welcome to our Muslim Futures author chat series, where we're talking to all the writers and filmmakers whose stories make up our upcoming amazing Muslim Futures anthology, which is coming soon to a bookstore near you. So the way that we're thinking about each of these episodes is just a chance to chat with one of our wonderful authors on a whole variety of things, anything that we want, from the sort of premises of like science fiction and magical realism that are embedded in a lot of these stories to the sort of like vast ways and different ways that we're all sort of connecting with our spirituality to, what does it take to envision an aspirational future, especially now as we're living in a dystopian present. So that's what we're here for. So today I'm super excited to be chatting with Randa Jarrar, author of Lunch at the Penal Colony. So welcome, Randa.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I'm super excited to chat with you about this story. So why don't we just get started with just giving us the overview? What is your story called? Even though I just said what it's called, but if you can tell us the title of your story, I just tell us what it's about.
Yeah, my Muslim future story, Lunch at the Penal Colony, is a fantastical sci-fi story about a robot called Janelle, who is part of this new enlightened um, group of robots, or I don't even want to call it AI. But the concept is that even though most robots and AI are programmed by human beings who are racist, sexist, transphobic, queerphobic, Islamophobic, etc., that this particular group of robots achieved a higher kind of calling and calibrated themselves to actually become um, fiercely, uh, I want to say, democratic slash radical in their approach to the world. And the story is set in a kind of Guantanamo space that is finally getting shut down by one of these enlightened beings. And it also features the hot queer woman who ferries the robot to the prison facility, and the prisoners, only one of whom is left, the cook who's lived on this island his entire life, and the kind of person in charge of the prison who, even though he's converted to Islam, is still, a piece of work, and hasn't actually learned to decolonize or move past a a world where prisons are, you know, a reality. So yeah, I was really just excited to get this group of characters together.
You started to touch on it a little bit in the way that you sort of talk about the story and the different elements and the different characters that are coming to bear. And like this story, especially, feels like there's just like so much world building that went into it and so much thinking about like what is the continuum that got us from like the present where we are right now to the aspirational future that you're envisioning. And I remember when we first started talking about the story, I thought it was really interesting that you were telling a story about an aspirational future that's set at a prison camp. And like, what does that mean? And what is the fact that there is a prison camp in the aspirational future? But I think the specific details around what has happened there, what is the state of it now? What does it say about the world, the current state of this penal colony? And so I think that's a really interesting touch point into hearing you talk a little bit about what is the broader nature of this aspirational future that you wanted to create. Like, where are we now in your world, and how did we get there from like the world that we're living in right now?
So one of the things that inspired me for the story was basically thinking about the ways that, as radicals, um, and leftists, the people I've spoken to have very broad ideas of how the world should be. But then when we start thinking about the actual details that go into an anti-carceral world, I think, well, there are literal prisons that will have to be dismantled. And who's going to dismantle them? Literally, who's going to take those apart and make it so that those prisons no longer are able to, perform their function? And so, in an ideal world, human beings wouldn't have to do that labor and a robot could. It's sort of like this meme that's going around where we thought robots were gonna, do the hard labor and we were gonna get to make art. And now it turns out AI is making art and we're doing the hard labor. Um, and so, yeah, I think that in the world that I want to live in, there is actual effort to dismantle harmful systems, which is gonna, require us to have really not fun conversations with some of the people who are still holding on to, like, literally holding on to the systems and administering them, and who really believe that it's important to imprison people, etc. And I wanted to imagine characters who would patiently explain, um, why those systems no longer serve us, but also be badass enough to kick them in the nuts if they needed to, and literally take back, um, those spaces and take them apart.
I love that. Um, yeah, it's interesting, right? Because it's like the tendency when you're trying to create an aspirational future is like you envision these systems and you look at the way that it's enabling people to thrive. But I think one of the things that's so interesting about your story is like one of the characters that you highlight is like very much clinging, as you were just saying, like to the sort of like pre-enlightenment world, and like what does it actually look like to be in a world where maybe not everybody bought into the aspirational future that has been created, and like what does that interaction between different characters look like, which I think is so great about your story. um I'm also just kind of curious to hear you speak a little bit about just in general what you find exciting about collaborating on a project like this. Like what made you say yes when we asked you to do this and to go down this road and envision this world and collaborate on this anthology? Like what are some of the things that like got you excited about it?
It's not, so some of the things that got me excited about it are the people involved. So just having good people such as yourself and Raya and other creators who I respect be part of this. And also, it's not every day that you get a call saying, hey, there's a bunch of Muslims that want to get together and write and co establish a book of futurisms. Like, it's pretty much unheard of. I'd been living in LA for years and hadn't gotten a call like that. So, it's just a very rare opportunity for us all to work together and to dream together. And I actually think that, truly the only way for us to build this kind of future is for us to talk to each other and work with each other and imagine and dream with each other. So sometimes that kind of opportunity and space alone is in itself so, so deeply important and needed. And we don't really get to do it as much as adults, and we don't get to do it in a world that is hyper fixated on capital, on selling, on making things for the masses. Um, and one of the things I liked about this project is that I got to, you know, explore a story that's just really weird, and I felt like it still belonged in that space. And so having the permission, having the space, pushing against, the rhetoric and narrative about Muslims that we're living through every single day is very important. And I wish there were more opportunities like this.
I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I also love, like, how weird this collection of stories is, and, like, how everybody just, like, really went for it in a lot of crazy ways, and I think that, like, you know, one of my favorite aspects of this was, like, going through the world building experience with all of you and just seeing, like, all the wild stuff that we put up on those boards, and then just, like, going through the process of seeing, like, what different individual authors gravitated towards in terms of thematic elements, and I think, you know, that idea of, like, sort of trying to create a variety of, like, aspirational futures that are, like, weird and wild in a variety of different ways, and then, like, that part was exciting, but then I feel like the most challenging part too was also then saying, like, "Okay, now what does, like, dramatic conflict look like in this world?" Because I think to your point of, like, the way that a lot of our creative practices are, by necessity sort of like housed within this like very sort of like, commercially driven ecosystem. There's a tendency to when you're like creating dramatic conflict to go towards, things like violence, right? And like we
Yeah.
were intentionally really trying to subvert that through these stories. And that was the probably one of the most fun things about working with you all on these stories is trying to think through like, yeah, what does dramatic conflict look like when we divorce it completely from trauma and violence because we're setting these things in aspirational worlds and it from like and that was a challenge for me too in my writing practice and so being able to sort of retrain my own mind and the things that I've been sort of led to believe about how you create conflict in a story and to really think in a more just sort of emotionally grounded way around how do you tell a story that is fully human and full of dramatic and emotional conflict, but doesn't lean into those really harmful tropes was really it felt really liberating. And seeing the ways that you all manifested that in your stories was like particularly exciting to me. And, when I think about what am I hoping some of the readers take away from this collection of stories? Like that's a big piece of it. Like I really hope that people can sort of read these stories and be like, oh yeah, actually, these are deeply emotionally resonant without having to rely on those tropes. And you know, that's something that's important to me, and I'm curious, like, when you think about your story, when you think about the collection of stories, because you've seen them all and read them all as well, like, what is it that you're hoping readers will take away from your story specifically, and perhaps from the broader collection as a whole?
Um, that's a great question. So, what I'm hoping people take away from my own story is um, an idea or several ideas about how we can move towards liberation and how to dream um, and imagine um, a world without prisons, even if it's just let's think about a world without prisons, without military, without um, that entire system. And I think one of the, earliest iterations of the story years ago was when I heard Obama say that he was going to shut down Guantanamo.
Mm,
And I was so excited because I was still kind of drinking the Kool-Aid and thinking, oh, things are going to really change. And it never happened. And so um, I think maybe thinking of ways beyond these established systems that we have um, and remembering our power as
mm.
communities to change the world that we live in. I also just want them to be entertained. I want them to, um, it's a story, first and foremost for other queer Muslims. Um, like I just love that there's a sex scene in it. Uh, and so, yeah, just entertainment, enjoyment. And then the entire anthology, what I want people to get out of it is a sense of belonging, hopefully, a kind of reference point for ways to dream and inspiration. So the more inspired and unhinged we can be in our dreams, I think the better. Because the other sides, the ones that are against, you know, uh, I don't know, they're also dreaming and they are wild in their dreams. So we have to dream just as wild and bigger.
I think that's so well said, and you move to a place that I wanted to ask you about as well, which is like, it's really hard. Like, obviously, we wrote these stories a couple of years ago, um, you know, during difficult times, but obviously, stakes are so much higher right now in so many different ways, 2 or 3 years later. And, like, I wasn't obviously joking when we started this thing and saying, like, it's really hard to envision aspirational futures when you're living in a dystopian present. And, you know, I I would love to hear you speak a little bit about from your experience and writing this story and telling this story, but just generally sort of trying to envision aspirational Muslim futures. Why specifically do you feel like that is important or necessary, like in this particular moment in 2025, when attacks are coming to our on our communities from so many different directions? And how are you thinking about the value or need for envisioning aspirational futures in this moment?
That's such a good question. Why do I think stories about aspirational Muslim futures are important or necessary in this moment? I think, it goes back to my belief that stories are so incredibly necessary. Everything that is powerful because there's been a story that we have been told about it. And that's how you get people to move different. That's how you get communities to change or to grow is through story. And so, um, just living in a world where there's a deeply disturbing white supremacist bent to the stories that we're seeing, I think it's like beyond time to hear from, you know, the hundreds of millions of people who don't believe that way or who are Muslim or who believe in a divinity that is forgiving and loving and powerful and beyond gender. Um, I've always found that to be the most powerful and like beautiful thing about Islam.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I wish this anthology could come out literally like every month. I wish every month we could have a giant collection of Muslims dreaming about the future.
Mm.
It should exist, like why should The Economist exist? Why should the New York Times, the New York war crimes exist? Why should, all these papers of record supposedly
Mm.
um, constantly be, recycling the same old rhetoric that doesn't actually represent what people believe in their hearts. And so, um, yeah, it's important, it's necessary, not just in this moment, but all the time. And it's inspiring, and I feel like we come from such a rich tradition of storytelling. We come from like rich histories and traditions, and our voices are the least heard in the world that we live in. And so it's beyond time to amplify them.
That's beautiful. I mean, it makes me think what you're talking about is like creating an archive, right? This story is like we're creating an archive of the future, like from within our own communities. I love
Absolutely. Yeah.
that. Um, Rhonda, I'm so grateful to have been able to collaborate with you on this project. And as I've
True.
told you many times, and I hope I still do, like I love your stories so much. And it's like there's such a richness to it in terms of the world building you've created and the collection of characters that you've brought together. And as you say, like there's so many different sort of like different like sort of clashing tones and melding tones in a different way in the project that in the story that I really love. And so it's been so great to collaborate with you on this story. I'm so grateful that you were down to write a story for it. And I can't wait for folks to read it. I can't wait for folks to read it and
Thank
read
you,
the
Kareem. I feel the same
I'm
way. I can't wait for people to read this, and also thank you for being such a great editor. It's so rare to have I've never had a Muslim editor, and I've never had a person of color, Muslim editor. So it's just been really great to have an editor like you on this project. I feel like it really, yeah, it really served the story and was really fun for me too.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad, right? If the process itself is not fun, like, what's the
Yeah,
point, right?
yeah. Period.
Um, I am super excited for folks to read your story, both in the prose fiction form and in the graphic novel form, which has its own fun little surprises and quirks, which I love. Um, and so I guess that does it for today. Thank you so much, Rhonda, for just having this chat with me. It was so nice to go through the process again of sort of like all the different elements that went into you creating this world and creating these characters in this story. Um, Appreciate you sharing your vision for sorry, my dog also wants to thank you for being a part of this project. And thanks folks for watching or listening along. There's going to be a link below or in the comments, depending on where you're seeing this, so you can pre-order your copy of the Muslim Futures anthology right now. And I can't wait for you to read them.